Welcome back everyone. So to answer this simple question, if we can get detail prints with FDM, I'm gonna use this massive model from V3D, Arthur Vernier. He's an absolutely amazing modeler, and as you can see, his models are filled with details. And because of the size, my resin printer cannot handle that. I wanted to print it full scale, and I did the whole thing on FDM. So as you can see, we can visually identify all the layer lines, and I think this is the biggest problems with the FDM. But it is still a very detailed print. You can see here, the veins or the skin texture, everything's very well captured, even in FDM. The caveat that we usually have with the resin printer is the build volume. This model is, I don't know, 80 centimeters tall, and unless I wanted to spend £1,000 on these big jumbo printers that we have, I think it's even more than that, I wouldn't be able to print that in resin. So I took my old FDM and managed to pull this print out of the Ender 3 Pro. And I'm gonna show you how to make it as close as possible to a resin print. If you look at the face, I know the face is probably the most common thing that everyone prints in resin, and the details here are just stunning. See the veins in the side of his face, the pores in the cheeks. I managed to capture everything. Of course, we have some caveats. If you look at the hair now against the light to see the layer lines there, but it is probably the best you can get with an FDM. And if you use this 3 method technique that I'm showing in a second, you might get rid of all these lines depending on how patient you are. I think this is the biggest trade-off between the resin and the FDM, is the post-processing. So as an example, I have here a sentinel head that I print in resin. This is a scrap print, by the way. You can see I had a bit of a shift in the bottom there, but you barely see the layer lines. And this is why for miniatures and stuff that is very detailed, the resin is recommended. But if you wanted to do something big like my Juggernaut here, I would need to spend a lot of money in a very big resin printer. So if you follow these guidelines here, I bet you will have very similar results from the resin. But I'm not arguing. The resin is much better for details, and it's probably going to print a lot quicker. And we all know with these high costs in electricity these days, printing for 3-4 days straight might increase a lot of your bills. So I'll show you my technique just now, and hopefully we'll get a better result just like this resin. And just before we start, overlook of the massive size of this sculpture. Like I said, I think it's almost a meter tall. It's very big. And some detail shots of the head, as I said, very good, but you can still see some layer lines in the hair. Here in the armor, you can definitely see some layer lines. This is a bear print. In the thighs, a lot of layer lines. So the easiest way to explain how you get a better definition is making an analogy with layer height versus pixels. I think everyone is very familiar with pixels in screens and everything. So if we take this example here, this figure, very high or very low resolution, sorry, you can see, for example, in the nose we have 5 squares making the nose, which doesn't really look like a nose. So if we break that into smaller pixels, like I'm doing here, and because it's a pixel, I'm breaking it into dimensions, and we start polishing either by removing or adding those pixels in and out, we can probably get a little bit more definition in the nose, make it a little bit more smooth and more with a curve. And if you want to go even further, you can go that indefinitely. It's definitely up to you, and this is what you will see in a very high definition screen like 8K or 4K, whatever. It is essentially what's happening. They're doubling the amount of pixels. They're dividing the minimum image square, let's say, into a even smaller square. By the way, in the resin printer, you see this is picking up a lot more now. You can see 4K, 6K, 8K screens, which is definitely going to help the resolution in the 2D layer. But the layer height itself is usually driven by the same, stepper motor versus the screw type of motion. So there is no reason why you shouldn't be getting the very same control in terms of the layer height in your FDM. So this is why what I'm going to show here in the slicing technique will allow you to get as good result as resin. So the trick here is all about the layer height. So in this example, if you're going to be slicing a sphere or a circle, the top half in 4 and the bottom half in 8 layers, you will have a lot more definition in the bottom half. So this is essentially what happens when you print in resin. Most people will run 50 micron or 0.05 millimeters in resin, and the FDM with the standard 0.4 nozzle, people usually run at 0.2 or 200 microns, so that's 4 times as big. So if you want to smooth like the bottom, you want a smaller layer height. And let's talk a little bit about the post-processing or the sanding and priming that everyone talks about when you run with FDM. This is definitely a little bit more complex on FDM because of the layer heights, essentially, the size of the steps. So you come with the primer, you add a thin layer of the primer on top of it, which usually will fill these little steps. And what you do next is that with the sand, you try to remove the high spots. This is essentially what you do with the sanding, and the priming will eliminate the low spots. So and then you can add another layer and then sand it again until you get the desired results. If you start sanding before you do the priming, what you do is you're removing material, and that will give you a smaller layer line essentially that your primer will need to fill. So I don't think there is a correct recipe. The only caveat is that if you sand it too much, you might be removing details, you might be removing texture from your bare prints, and this is what we don't want, especially when you have a very nice scope like the one I'm showing right here. But you can do that as many times as needed to get the smooth results. Right, onto the slicer. The first thing you will need to do is to orient your part properly. So wherever the supports are having the interface, and usually you will have a bad interface no matter what you do, is try to hide that. So in this head, for example, I'm going to be positioning that in a way that the supports will be here at the bottom. So whenever I put that in my figure, it will not show up. To make that easy, I'm using Cura, by the way, but any slicer can do the very same thing. Just find the rotation tool and you make sure you remove the snap rotation. So that will give you free rotation access. And then I'll position that to the better way. Here in Cura, you will show the overhang higher than my threshold here, which I set up to 65. That's my overhang threshold for supports. So everything that is red will be supported, and as you can see, the density is very low. It doesn't matter too much. I try to use as low as possible to save time and also filament. Okay, so in this case here, I'm orienting that up because I don't want supports, or I don't want things to be ruining the main face, like the nose or the eyebrows, the lips. So facing it upwards during the print will make it a lot support clean. If I tilt it, in a vertical position like this, you will see a lot of red areas, which will indicate that this will either not come very clean or will require some support. So the best solution that I found for this one is to tilt it backwards. So in resin printer, you usually tilt your models for a different reason. It has to do with the the angle of the layer height and the suction, but let's just focus here on the FDM. The main reason you would do that is to hide supports from visible areas that you don't want damaging. So you put the supports in a hidden position. Here at the bottom you see this tiny blue area. In Cura, if you look from the bottom of the bed plate, this is the part that is touching the plate. So you need to be careful in how your supports will be holding your part in place. If in this case here there is not a flat area, I cannot support it very well. So it will require you to use your supports and make sure you will have this fully balancing, otherwise you will have a shift and you will have a massive failure. So in this case here, it's the contact area will be very limited, but the supports will be all the interface to the bed. And this is why I like to use brim to keep the supports stuck to the bed no matter what. You can use a raft as well, I think it doesn't matter too much, but I particularly use a brim that will make all the supports, no matter how small they are, very well stuck to the bed. If you go to the other settings, I'm printing it in PLA. If you're printing ABS, I would say turn off your cooling, but I print with full cooling because of PLA. Retraction, my retraction test for my filaments usually doesn't vary too much, so I'm using 3.5 millimeters at 35, and I usually don't need to use Z-Hop, but if you have problems, by all means use that one. Speed, I try not to go over 65 millimeters per second in the overall print. And the first layer I always try to do very slow to make sure I have a good adhesion. And this is why I also try to print a few degrees hotter in the first layers to give it enough time for the filament to melt and kind of grab the table as good as possible. I also try to keep the temperature on the bed a little bit higher, and then I cool down later to save energy. If you want to understand how much this would impact your cost, check my video in the link. I have a detailed consumption video in the link. But the temperature will depend on your filament. Infill doesn't matter too much. I use the 3% gyroid. I'll show you after the slicing why it doesn't matter too much in this case, because there is essentially no overhang in the top. And now to the most important parameter on the slicer, the layer height. And these two parameters here, the top and the bottom, will be a function of your layer height. As I said at the beginning, the layer height will give you the detail that you want. On a resin printer, I think most of people will print with a 0.05 or 50 microns of layer height. Here in FDM, the lowest I could get with a 0.4 nozzle was at 0.08, so almost twice as high as the resin. And this is where you will be able to see easily the layer lines. If you look at my initial layer height, I always keep that to 0.2 just to keep the consistency in bed leveling and the squishing that we always want for a good and perfect adhesion. So no matter what I do, I'll always keep this a constant for all my prints. Bear in mind that the lower the layer height, the longer your printer will take to finish the print. So let's slice here and see what Cura has to estimate. So it took my computer a couple of minutes to slice because of the number of layers, and as you can see, it will take me roughly 10 hours for this 6 centimeter tall head. Make sure you make a preview and you're happy with the supports as they are. And remember, I mentioned about the brims to see how we have a very good contact area that will ensure my head will not shift and I will have that perfect finish layer after layer. So this is why the brim is fundamental to your supports, because the area might not be wide enough. And so far in the front, no supports as we were expecting, so that should come very clean. Here in the ear, the area of contact might be a bit too small, but we'll see how this one goes. And remember, we were talking about infill. So if we scroll down to the middle of the head, you will see that internally there isn't really a lot of overhang. So the infill in this case doesn't matter too much. I would recommend go a little bit more on the infill if you have a steep angle or a very decent overhang. For this head, you will see the walls, they will build one on top of each other. Therefore, you wouldn't really need a lot of the infill. The infill is almost like an internal support that you would like to get rigidity into your part. So as you see here, as we keep increasing layer after layer, they should be built on top of each of the walls, not really on the infill. Apart from these areas here, you see this yellow is a supporting area, but because this is internal, you're probably not going to be seeing this overhang. So I'm quite happy with this slice. You just need to save it and send it to your printer and wait 10 hours. So after you remove all the supports as usual, let's go for the first set of primer. I'm UK, I'm using this U-Pole primer. It doesn't matter too much which primer you use right now. What we want to do is a thin coat to allow everything to be in the same color. I like gray because it highlights a lot of the blemishes and all the layer defects that you will find in a print, no matter how good they are. So if you see that red one now, will start showing a lot of the layer lines. On the helmet, I had sanded and applied this step once. So essentially what you want to be doing is repeating between this step and the following, so until you're happy with the texture that your prints are. So just apply a thin coat evenly across the whole print and allow that to dry. Don't go too heavy, because again the idea here is just to highlight the defects. We're not trying to prepare the surface right now. So try to spray that evenly across the whole part. So let it dry now, but you can see that everything in a single color now, the gray. Depending on the angle of the light, you'll be able to spot all the layer lines and the major defects on your print. So for example, on the bridge of the nose for the helmet, here in the chest piece on the left hand side, you can spot the layer lines, which I'm going to be sanding in a second. So yeah, let it dry and come back after. Now that everything is dry, you grab a sandpaper. I'm using 220 grit, and you're going to be attacking the areas that you're not very happy with. You don't need to attack, for example, the keys, because this is going to be hidden anyway, so don't spend your time here. But here in the front, for example, I'll be sanding this part. You can spot the layer lines a lot easier now with everything in single color. In the left, you see there is a bit of a layer line, but there is also a bit of a texture, so you need to be very careful not to remove that texture. As I said, on the helmet here, I'm not very happy with the front of the face and the nose area, so I'm going to be filling that. I'll show you in a second how I do that. But yeah, just attack the areas that you're not very happy with. And you want to be very smooth. You usually will try to sand that perpendicular to the layer line. So don't do like that, do like that, okay? Because the layer lines, if you send in the same direction of the layer lines, it's easier to remove the primer and the layer itself, so it doesn't smooth out. If you remember my step case schematic, that's how things get smooth. So try to go perpendicular to the layer lines. That will make the effort a lot less, and of course you try not to remove as much material as you sand. So yeah, this is the boring part. I usually try to spend just 2 or 3 minutes per piece in a piece this size, because I don't want to over sand it to a point that I will remove texture. And this is probably the worst part on FDM compared to resin. On resin, usually a very quick buff with the sandpaper would be enough. So you see here, I don't want to remove the texture, I just want to remove the layer lines. If you have any areas that are a little bit worse than the others, like for example this bridge of the nose here, you can see there's like small gaps in the layers, you're probably going to be using some filler. I'm going to show you what I use in just a minute, but try to go and scan through your part and see the areas that you would be filling, because it's missing material. You can use a filler primer as well, but if you use a very thick one, you might be losing some texture, as I said, and we really don't want that. So using the filler allows you to go very, very localized. See here in the back of the helmet as well, there's a tiny little defect. Here in the bottom, you see the layer lines are showing up a little bit more evidently. So here as well, see a big gap, very deep, almost like a scratch going around the whole piece. So this is the part that we're going to be filling. I like to use this is standard drywall filler. I like to use this flexible one because it allows you to kind of flex the part a little bit if you have some expansion with heat or whatever, so it doesn't crack that. But any drywall filler would work. I like in these little tubes. It's a little bit more expensive, but still very cheap. I like on these tubes because you essentially, like a toothpaste tube, you just squeeze a little bit into your the tip of your finger like this and apply in the localized area, just a very tiny bit. If the defect is big enough or too deep, yes, you're going to be using a lot, but usually I just quickly apply that to the area. And it doesn't need to be perfect. You want to spread over the area that you're trying to fill, because after it's dry, you're going to be sanding. So that big defect there, see, I'm spreading, and now it's good to spread it in the same direction of the defect because you want it to fill the crevices, okay? And this is why when you sand it, you don't want to do that because you don't want to remove that from the gaps you filled. So depending on how big your defects are, in my case here, they're not very big, very, very thin layer. You've seen the amount of material that I'm using, very, very small. And this should dry fairly quickly. But I'd say don't rush, because especially this flexible one, it tries to peel a little bit. So don't rush, let it dry maybe overnight or something and come back later. On the face here, because it was already quite smooth, I didn't have any big defects. You're able to spot here in the close to the ear, a little bit of the defect here in the bottom of the chin, but you definitely don't want to get rid of these veins. You see, this is where what it makes it pop. You don't want to send that away, but you can see some minor defects, especially here in the ear. So I'm probably going to be filling that off camera just to be able to. You can use any small tools like those silicone brushes or anything that would help you to tap the material in, but in my case here I'm just using my fingers. You can see here also in the hair there's quite a lot of layer lines that are perceptible, so we're going to be sanding that as well. But yeah, I will attack the ear and the back of the head now. Now that it's dry, it's time for sanding again, and a piece of kit that I like to use are these, I don't know, flexible nail tools, whatever. It's a bit of a sandpaper in a squishy material, and what it does is, because it's not so stiff, it allows you to go through the contour of the piece. For example, here in the face, just a light buff would make the sandpaper to bend over and not remove so much material on the high spot. So it kind of helps you to stabilize the pressure just with a very soft brush like this. So onto the helmet, just a quick buff, again perpendicular to the direction of the layers, and that should just smooth that out and not remove the gaps that you filled. Just a gentle buff, don't pressure too much, you don't want to remove the texture. Once again, just enough to make it smooth. As I said, you see this flexible filler, it gunks up a little bit. It doesn't create a dust, it's more like a tiny particle. But I quite like this one because it allows the part to expand and contract without creating cracks in the areas that you filled. Here in the nose, just buffing a little bit harder. You can probably use smaller tools to sand in these difficult areas. And apologies for doing that off camera here. It's very difficult to keep the work centralized in my paint booth. But yeah, just a very quick buff. Don't want to spend much time on that one. And this is the final result. For the head, I'm gonna go back to the sandpaper because I need to remove a little bit more of the material. These are the areas that were a little bit, overhanged and it's not so smooth. So I need to go with a little bit more abrasive method. So this is why I went back to the sandpaper, and I'm trying to remove, and this is the area that was stick to the bed, if you remember when we sliced. So just try to bend the sandpaper and carve the very same texture that you would have for the hair, for example. So try to design that and carve that using your sandpaper. And once again, using the flexible buffer here, just to kind of smooth out some of the layer lines that we can see in the face. Not a lot of pressure, just to get everything smoothed out. You don't want to remove the skin texture. The top of the head here, again, use the buffer, and that should be enough to minimize the layer line effects that you see in the hair. Once you're happy with the sanding, again, don't spend much time. It's time for the primer. Just clean your part. I like to use this Army Painter one. This is the final, let's say, primer that I'll be using in this part. I like this Army Painter one because I've never had any problems with that, and especially for a face, it can easily be used as a skin tone or a base skin tone if you prefer. So yeah, this is the final layer. You could alternate between steps 1 and 2 as many times as you need. Okay, in the face, for example, I just did what I've recorded here, nothing more than that, just a couple of minutes sanding and buffing that one. But on the helmet and the chest piece, I've alternated between 2 or 3 times, if I'm not wrong, on the chest piece. Again, now you can be a little bit more generous because this is going to be the preparation primer, and hopefully it's going to be smooth enough for you to start painting. So this is the final result once everything is dried. As I said, for this piece I did 3 rounds of sanding and primering before applying the final coat here with the Army Painter one. And as you can see here, I could probably be a little bit more close to this detail, but you definitely don't want to remove that by sanding too much. This is the helmet. You can see it's much better. Still see a tiny bit of layer lines, maybe here in the eyes. I can probably come back to this using a small tool, but the other parts are just very, very good. You see, I've managed to keep the texture, the main textures, but also I got rid of that big defect on layer line, so I'm quite happy with the helmet now. Maybe here in the mouth as well, I can use a bit of a sanding. And the head, again, the one that I didn't spend much time because it was already good enough. You can see still the back of the head. where we had the very big defects on the hair. I could probably spend a little bit more time, but definitely a lot better. You barely see the layer lines, and I wonder when we paint that with the brown, it's gonna hide that a little bit. Yeah, I'm quite happy. You can see the vein there. You don't want to lose that. This is the final preparation after the painting. And just before we wrap up, this is the overlook of the torso of the piece. Again, an amazing sculpt by Arthur in V3D. Just drop him a note if you want this model. I'm going to be sending the torso later, but just using the very same steps. Thank you very much, everyone. See you next time.